devotional reading this morning comes from a book that actually we were asked to read one year. We went on an Appalachian service project. It's called Yours Are the Hands of Christ, The Practice of Faith by James Howell. And he says this: Robert Greenleaf persuasively argued that all great leaders are servants first and always. People respond best and perhaps only to those who have proven themselves trustworthy as servants. Companies and institutions are foolish to fail to keep servanthood as the fulcrum of all they are about. If listening, empathy, and taking into account people's needs and limitations can be regarded as crucial in business, how much more should followers of Christ be noteworthy primarily for their humble and compassionate service of others? I read that Mother Teresa once said that if at the end of the day you want to examine your conscience, just look at your hands. What have your hands done today? Whom have they served? Has the imprint of Christ's image been left on anything those hands have touched? Yours are the hands with which Christ is to serve now.
The scripture reading today comes from Mark 10:35 through 45. Zebedee's children, James and John, approached Jesus. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to grant our request." "What is it?" Jesus asked. They replied, "See to it that we sit next to you, one at your right and one at your left, when you come into your glory." Jesus told them, "You do not know what you are asking. Can you drink the cup I will drink, or be baptized in the same baptism as I?" "We can," they replied. Jesus said in response, "From the cup I drink of you, you will drink. The baptism I am immersed in, you will share. But as for sitting at my right or my left, that is not mine to give. It is for those to whom it has been reserved." The other 10, on hearing this, became indignant of James and John. Jesus called them together and said, "You know how among the Gentiles those who exercise authority are domineering and arrogant. Those great ones know how to make their own importance felt. But it can't be like that with you. Anyone among you who aspires to greatness must serve the rest. Whoever wants to rank first among you must serve the needs of all. The promised one has come not to be served, but to serve, to give one life in ransom for the many."
Thanks, Shirley. Would you pray with me? Divine Essence, as we take a deep breath and center ourselves in your spirit, may we always honestly look at our lives, watch where we're connected to you, where we're not connected to you, watch where we're called and what we're asked. Let us allow your presence to touch our hearts and our lives. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be filled with your wisdom and your insight. Amen. So I've read this passage probably dozens of times. And it was always very clear to me that the disciples were a little thick-headed in this passage, that they didn't quite get the impact of what Jesus was trying to say to them. But until this last week, for whatever reason, it never quite struck me that they weren't just a little bit off. Like, the disciples are on a completely different page. So in the paragraph right before the ones that Shirley read, Jesus and the disciples are heading to Jerusalem. And Mark once again has Jesus talking about his suffering and his death and his resurrection. Mark hammers on this over and over and over again. And the disciples just kind of seem to let it go over their heads. It's sort of like a, yeah, whatever, Jesus, because we know you're the Messiah. And this is where I think they're completely on a different page. Jesus is like, no, you don't get it. This is what's going to happen. And the disciples are thinking Jesus is still going to be this great king, an earthly king, who is going to bring peace and justice and bring the Israelites back to rule the area. So when James and John are arguing about who gets to sit at the right and left hand of Jesus, it's not in some heavenly realm somewhere, although that's what Jesus alludes to later. They're talking about, like, now. Jesus, when you come into your glory, like, when you take over everything, can we sit next to you at the banquet? Can we have the right and left hand when we're toasting our victory? That's what they're asking. And Jesus looks at them and says, you know, you really don't. You don't know what you're asking. You don't get it. Can you drink the cup that I'm going to... And he uses these metaphors so that they don't get it any further than they did a minute ago. Can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink from? And can you be baptized with the same baptism? And James and John are like, oh yeah, Jesus, anything you can do, we can do too. No problem. And in a moment that seems prophetic, Jesus agrees with them. And I say seems prophetic because we have to remember that Mark was written 40 years after Jesus died. So at this point, we already know, it was already fact that James had been martyred. He was already dead. Peter and Paul were probably also already martyred. A number of the other disciples, according to legend, in fact, the only one we're not quite sure what happened to is John, but all of the rest, legend and story has it that they suffered and were martyred somewhere. So it was not a stretch to say, if you actually follow what Jesus is asking you to do, if you continue to preach the gospel, then it's awfully likely that you're going to end up with a violent end. But once again, James and John don't really get it. And Jesus says, as for sitting at the right and left hand of me, well, that's not really up to me. And again, there's this allusion to maybe God in a different realm somewhere. But all the other disciples jump in here and they're on John and James's case, just like kids arguing about who gets to sit shotgun, right? All of us did that, right? Your kids probably, I want to sit in the front seat. They're doing the same thing. All of them, all adult men arguing about this. And Jesus uses it as a teaching moment, to his credit. And he says, okay, all of those powerful, arrogant, dictatorial leaders, and they're all like, yeah, we know them. And Jesus is like, yeah, all those ones that make sure that that you're lesser than them, that they're better than you. They're like, yeah, we know those guys. Jesus is like, don't be them. Don't be them. You don't get to be them if you're going to follow me. Because if you want to be great, you have to be servant of all. Well, talk about popping the balloon, really? They're like, well, shoot, Jesus, that's not what we're here for. There was no ethos in that time, probably not in this time, of getting to be great if you're a servant. If you were a servant, you were at the mercy of the rich and powerful who employed you. You said, when somebody said jump, what? You said yes and how high? Yeah. Good chance you were a slave if you were serving. Nobody wants to be that. So this whole concept of serving to be great was really not, they probably, I wonder if they were all grumpy gripers. Really? Oh, Jesus, we have to. I'm kind of tired. I wonder how long it took them to get with the program of how serving makes one great. And I think the reality is that today we have the same ethos. Everybody wants to be the powerful, rich, in charge who tell everybody what to do. Nobody wants to even be the sunny servant. So why is it, becomes the question, why is it that serving is such an important spiritual thing? Let's start with the question of what does true service look like? What are the kids, this is where you talk back. What are the characteristics?
Humble.
To be humble.
Giving without expecting.
Giving without expecting.
Understanding what people need.
Understanding what people need, as opposed to assuming, perhaps, what people need, which might require asking them what they need. Clarice?
I was going to say that. Some people get in their head their idea of what serving is, and they force it on you, whether you need that or not.
Right, so not to take your idea of what you think somebody else wants and force it on them.
Serving without thinking someone is going to give you something in return.
Sure, so not serving to get, even if it's just appreciation, but serving for the sake of serving. And because we're all humans, right? So serving can't have what involved in it?
Ego.
Ego.
So it's selfless.
It's selfless, yes. It's thinking of the other. And now I want to make sure that when we're talking about being humble, that does not mean being humiliated. It simply means not having your ego involved in it. There's also no power play involved. True serving is about serving as equals, not going and saying, well, I've got something that, I can offer you because I'm so much better than you, and then it becomes a power play, right? There is none of that in true service. So why is all of that part of our spiritual path? Anybody?
It's showing love and kindness.
It's showing love and kindness. I think it's that, and it's recognizing that we're all one. Underneath all of it, you're in this crazy mixed up world just as much as I am. And we're here to help each other. So, the song that we sang, the servant song, starts with, brother, sister, let me serve you. Let me be as Christ to you. Pray that I may have the strength to let you be my servant too. So I have devotional books from the Maryknoll missioners. And one of the lay missioners, whose name is Angel Mortel, writes about how she used the servant song. She and her husband used the servant song in their wedding ceremony to set the tone for the two of them continuing to offer themselves fully to each other in their lives, but also to remind them to remain open to receiving graciously from each other. She said that true connection and relationship comes when serving goes both ways. Right? When serving goes both ways, because everyone has something to offer. So, how many of you have seen the Disney movie Aladdin? No? Oh my gosh, all right, I hope some of you. Robin Williams is awesome in that. If you have not seen that, you have got to go see it. So there's this great line in there. Yes, Chase remembers it. So you remember Iago the parrot, Chase? who's like the evil villain's sidekick, right? There's like this great line in the movie that I use on Julie all the time, and she hates it, which is probably why I use it on her all the time. But she may ask me to get something for her, and I bring it to her, and I say, "My life is but to serve you, my liege," is the line from the movie. But the reality is that my life is, or should be, to serve. And there may be days where I'm more selfish than others, and there may be days when I'm a grumpy griper a little bit. But I strive, at least, to be the sunny servant as much as possible. Or the sarcastic servant. All those good S words. So Angel goes on to tell a story about a woman named Maria that she met in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Maria had 7 children, and she was supporting them by herself because her husband was in jail. And when Angel got there as a missioner, she noticed that Maria and her family were sort of isolated in the midst of this community, that they really didn't interact with others. And she finally asked about that, and she found out that Maria's husband was incarcerated because he was a notorious drug trafficker. And people were afraid to be associated with the family. Well, unfortunately, Maria, the only decent work she could find was 2 hours away by bus into downtown Sao Paulo as a housekeeper. Her kids were between the ages of 2 and 12. And she didn't have the money for anyone to care for the kids. So, in the summers, she left them with the older kids, locked them in the house, said don't go anywhere, and put the older kids in charge. This story happened during the school year, when the 4 oldest ones were off at school. And she had left instructions that they were to lock the younger ones in the house, and to me it sounds more like a gated yard and house, and to take the key with them so that they wouldn't get out. Well, Roberto, who was 7, decided he wanted coffee, and so he put on a pot of water to boil, and when he took it off to pour it, the pot broke and the water fell all over his 5-year-old sister's leg. Mariana went into shock, and somebody had to get help, but they were locked in the house. So he went out in the backyard, he climbed over the fence into the neighbor's yard. The neighbors weren't home. He had to squeeze through the bars of their front gate, and found someone to call for emergency help. Mariana was in the hospital for 2 months. The community heard about this. Word travels fast. And they felt for her. They understood the struggle of trying to take care of kids by yourself. They understood the frustration of not being able to find decent work anywhere close to home. They understood the fear of the street violence and wanting to keep your kids safe. Oh, Maria quit her job 2 hours away and stayed home because she was now even more worried for her children. But this made it even harder for her to make ends meet. There were doctor's appointments, follow-ups that Mariana had to get to that she couldn't always get her to. There was a special sock she needed to keep the skin on while her leg healed, but she couldn't afford it. She just couldn't manage to save enough money to buy that sock. Well, eventually, the little Catholic church in the area raised the money for her to purchase the sock. And all of those folks were poor too. This is not a rich community. They raised about $300 in US terms. Most of it was coins. So she could finally pay for that sock. And then a couple of the community members started to help her with childcare and bring them some food. And Maria was so grateful to the members of this church that she went to a few of the leaders of the church and she said, thank you so much. I'd like to do something for you. What can I do? And the parish leaders said, oh, you don't need to do anything. You know, it's our role to serve you, and you don't need to pay us anything. You don't need to do anything. That's just what we do. And then on the side, the leader turned to someone else and said, well, what could she do for us anyways? She can't read, she doesn't have any time, she has all those kids. Well, Maria found something she could do anyways. And every week, she took the altar cloths home and she washed them. And every Sunday after Mass, she swept the floor. She started going to Mass. She sent her kids to catechism. She sent her older kids to help with church events. And slowly but surely, she became an integrated part of that community. And the relationship of giving and receiving on both parts continued. For the leaders to say that, it's kind of those arrogant leaders that Jesus is talking about, who look down on others. We will help you because we're so much better than you. It's a power play. And it's hurtful. And it doesn't build a relationship. It doesn't build connection with one another or with God. Everyone has something to offer. And it's important in building spiritual relationships that we learn to give and receive. And I don't know how many of you were here the first week we had Neeks here, our asylum seeker, when he came and we kind of introduced him. That week, Pat and Dick Ehlert were circulating a sign up for the weed out, where we were going to go and pull out invasive species at Colonial Park. Well, okay, so my bad. I would never think to ask this new person to join us, much less Julie's nephew, who was along to interpret. But in fact, Dick, they went up and said, hey, why don't she come help? And they went. They signed up. Greg drove up from Kenosha. Neeks told me that day, he said, I've been waiting 3 days for this. I'm so excited to be here. Of course, he's new in this age. He was doing nothing but like sitting staring at the ceiling. But he was so excited to be there and helping and doing something productive for the community. It's a give and take relationship. So the question becomes, looking once again inside ourselves, are we sunny servers? Are we grumpy gripers? And when are we which? Where do we serve? How do we serve? And I want to be clear that serving is not just to the poor and the needy and the elderly. The serving is to our partners and our neighbors and our children and our parents, our teachers and our bosses and our coworkers, our friends. Jesus was clear. Everyone we serve to. And then do we allow others to serve us? Clarice, if somebody says, how can I help? What do you say? Yeah. Yeah, I don't need anything. I'm good. I'm pretty sure I tried that a few weeks ago. I'm sorry to point you out, because almost all of us are like that, right? Because we've been brought up in this ethos, again, of where it's good to have money and power and status and recognition. It's not so good to be the one who serves. Or who needs. Right. And when we say, well, I will do something for you, but I don't want anything from you, Well, that immediately sort of sets up you're less than, you're needy, it's like a negative bad thing, right? So we all have to learn when somebody says, how can I help? To think of something. Even if it's little. Because that's a relationship. That's a connection. And I think that's about all I got. Amen.
Amen.